Thank you, Tori. Good morning again. Tori, thank you for sharing that wonderful responsive reading about waiting, written by my colleague and a former minister of this congregation, Reverend Leslie Takahashi. How many of you remember Reverend Leslie? Yes, quite a few of you. Yes, indeed. You'll be hearing me use more of Leslie's words in future services. She's a wonderful I say worship writer, because that's what I use the words for. But Leslie has a wonderful voice, which of course many of you all know, and so I'm delighted to be able to bring her words back into our service. And Tori, it's wonderful to have you join our Worship Weaver team. Yay, absolutely. I look forward to working with you many times in the future. So I hope all of you had a wonderful and joyful Thanksgiving holiday. You know, the holidays can sometimes be a mixed bag. Sometimes they're wonderful and joyful. Sometimes they can be a little tense and stressful. So I hope on balance, most of you had a wonderful holiday time. My family, we traveled to coastal Virginia to spend a few days with our son and daughter-in-law who live in Boston, but her parents own a pretty place right on a river in a little town called Weems, Virginia, and we had a chance to relax, and I played, well, I don't know if played's the right word, a little golf. Not sure if what I did could actually be called golf. It was more like a treasure hunt in the woods, but anyway, and I ate way too much food. This is like confession time now. And I thought about, boy, if I only had a treadmill here, I could preach while being on a treadmill. That would be good, but not sure how well that would work out. So I will say it's really good to be back with all of you in the loving and kind and joyful arms of this wonderful community. I will say that these weeks have certainly been hard, painful for, I think, really everyone in our community and in our country, especially for those connected to the UVA community. And there's, of course, been other acts of violence since then. There is just so much loss, so much pain, and yes, so much trauma in our communities, in our nation, and in the world. I keep waiting for things to change, for the world to return to some semblance of normalcy, and for humanity to at least begin to find a way to get along. But I'm sorry to say that the waiting shows no signs of ending. And often it feels as if there's little reason to hope that things will get better. I know I've really cheered you all up now. But speaking of waiting, I want to share a few thoughts with you this morning about waiting and the connection it has to at least finding some semblance of hope. Waiting and hope are, as you already heard, are key aspects of the season of Advent, which of course we observed earlier when Tori lit the first candle, which today is the candle of hope. Now, as I understand it, the word Advent literally means the beginning of or the coming of, as in the coming of something new, something important, something life-changing. In the Christian tradition, Advent is really about two comings, both of which are connected to Jesus of Nazareth. The first took place over 2,000 years ago when a tiny babe was born in a manger in Bethlehem. The second has not yet occurred and refers to the coming of the resurrected Jesus, who many Christians believe will return at the end of time. Now, I think it's fair to say that we Unitarian Universalists are pretty comfortable thinking and talking about the first understanding of the coming of Jesus, meaning the coming of the human being called Jesus of Nazareth, who lived and preached a message of love, compassion, and welcome for all people, including and especially those who are marginalized, reviled, or rejected. That's the Jesus I will talk about on Christmas Eve in a few weeks. And it's a Jesus in whom many, many Unitarian Universalists, myself included, find wisdom, truth, and inspiration. While that first coming of Jesus, the teacher and preacher, has always played a really important role in Unitarian Universalism, the idea of the second coming has been, and I'd say for many still is, a bit more challenging and perhaps even problematic for many Unitarian Universalists. For those who may be new to our tradition, we UUs embrace the use of reason and science. We see ultimate reality as an unfolding mystery rather than a certainty set in stone. And we draw wisdom from many religious traditions rather than privileging one tradition over all others. So I think it's fair to say that belief in a second coming that would be contrary to reason and the laws of nature, and that would privilege one religion, one theology, one sacred story over all others, strikes at least some of us as being a bit hard to believe or comprehend. Now, if you believe and comprehend that, I admire that, I respect that. That belief, as all beliefs, are welcome in Unitarian Universalism, and I'd love to chat with you about it sometime and hear more about your beliefs and your faith. But given these questions and perhaps even doubts about a kind of cosmic second coming, where does that leave Unitarian Universalism when it comes to the season of Advent? Should we simply focus on the tiny baby in the manger, or maybe we should just ignore all Advent altogether? Or can we find a deeper meaning, or perhaps a different meaning, during this time of the year? And this morning, I want to try to make the case that there is a great deal we UUs can learn from Advent, and what we can learn has everything to do with what I'm going to call the spirituality of waiting and darkness. Now, before I delve into this spirituality of waiting and darkness, let me offer a couple of caveats. First, there is little that is spiritual about certain kinds of waiting. Think for a moment about the UVA community 2 Sunday nights ago and what many of our children too often face while at school. I can't even begin to imagine the stress and anxiety of waiting during a shelter-in-place order and how fearful that was, not only for those on grounds, but for their loved ones. Or consider the waiting that most of us have had to or will have to face at one time or another when we or a loved one has to wait for a medical diagnosis or the results of a battery of tests or scans. I've dealt with that stress some years ago, and I can say that this kind of waiting was the farthest thing from spiritual I can imagine. And as much as we try to breathe through the fear and uncertainty, waiting to find out if our children are safe or if our lives are about to be turned upside down forever, is so incredibly hard, and I don't see anything to recommend or celebrate about that kind of waiting. There's also another kind of waiting that the world would be far better off without. That is the unconscionable waiting for justice and liberation, those who are marginalized and oppressed are forced to endure every day. As a lifelong beneficiary of white male privilege, I cannot even begin to imagine what it's like to be discriminated against and treated as less than because of the color of my skin, my gender, my sexual orientation, my immigration status, my age, my physical abilities, my economic situation, or one of the many other categories that are used to confer privilege on some while demeaning and dispossessing others. There is nothing noble or admirable about waiting for justice and fairness, and that's why Dr. King titled one of his most famous books, Why We Can't Wait. Now, by now, you're probably thinking that I've changed my mind, that I'm going to preach a sermon against the whole idea of waiting. And I must say that waiting has never been something that I'm very good at. Patience has not really been one of my virtues, and my go-to place is generally to move on or keep going rather than having the patience to stay put and to wait. If you're ever riding with me in a car and we're trying to park in a crowded parking lot where you have to circle for a long time, you'll see this. I'm the kind of guy that goes, oh, heck with this, and I just, drive on somewhere else. So I don't have a lot of patience in crowded parking lots. But as I've reflected more on my own spiritual journey, and especially on those moments when I've slowed down, when I've stopped the mad dash for that parking spot or the rush to get everything on my to-do list done, in those moments when I do find myself simply waiting and being present rather than rushing and trying to do more and do it faster, something inside begins to shift. It's not that I'm necessarily waiting for a specific thing to get done or a goal to be accomplished. Rather, I'm just waiting and listening. Waiting for the universe or my own heart or perhaps the spirit of life to speak, to teach, to take me to a place of depth and sometimes discomfort, and to bring me to a new and deeper sense of understanding and peace. It is this kind of waiting, waiting as listening, waiting as learning, waiting as being open to beginning anew. It is this kind of waiting I want to explore with you today. Now, as I said, waiting has never been easy for me, and impatience and hurry are generally my go-to places. In fact, in order to really be intentional and experience the kind of waiting that I've described a minute ago, the waiting that breaks through the stress, the distraction, and the impatience so that we can truly listen and grow, that kind of waiting is something I have often found at particular places and in particular moments. And I'd like to tell you about one of those moments and one of those places. A place where I waited until I found my way to connection, peace, and healing. A place that enabled me to put much of the fear and stress of life behind me and that opened my heart to love, peace, and hope. Now, this particular experience I want to share with you took place some years ago when I was on a retreat at a monastery called the Abbey of Gethsemani. Any of you ever heard of the Abbey of Gethsemani? It's probably the most famous monastery in this country because it was the monastery of Thomas Merton, who lived there for many, many years. And the Abbey, by the way, for those of you who don't know it, is located in Kentucky, about halfway between Louisville and Lexington. Now, the monks at this particular monastery are Trappists, which is one of the most austere and strict monastic orders. Silence is basically observed day and night, and the monks only speak when it is necessary for their work and when they are observing the daily office, which is the regimen of 8 prayer services they participate in every day. I think it's fair to say that as hard as waiting is for me, silence, and especially that much silence, has been even harder because most of the time I'm addicted to noise and distraction. But while I've always found silence to be challenging, there's something inside me that keeps seeking it out. I find myself drawn to places like monasteries where I become part of a completely different world and way of life. A way of life in which I'm required to wait and listen. Wait and listen. Wait and listen. Now, a number of years before my visit to Gethsemane, I had spent a week on retreat at another monastery that also had extended periods of silence. I kept a journal that week, and it was filled with my struggles with waiting and listening. I reread it from time to time, and every time I do, I keep reading about my impatience with waiting for something to happen, or about having some kind of transcendent moment or deep spiritual experience. I guess I thought that at the time, and this was, I think, maybe the first retreat at a monastery I'd ever been on, I guess I thought at the time that, when you're at a monastery for 5 days or something, that you're supposed to have some special gateway to the divine is supposed to open up, or maybe some taste of nirvana or something like that. But for the first few days, I wasn't experiencing anything that remotely resembled that. Instead, all I experienced was the same old me, lost and uncertain about what to do without all the noise and busyness to distract me. But as time went on that week, something began to slowly change. Those anxious and impatient voices I kept hearing started to say something else. They began to become a bit kinder and more compassionate. The pages of my journal began to fill with understanding and gentleness rather than judgment and condemnation. What I ultimately heard that week was a voice telling me, even though you're imperfect, flawed, and most of the time pretty much a total mess, you're okay. You're acceptable. You're worthy of giving and receiving love. And what was so astonishing about that retreat was that although waiting in silence for something had taken me to a challenging place, a place where lots of negativity came up about being inadequate and so on, the waiting in the silence didn't leave me in that place. Instead, waiting in the silence created a space in my life, in my heart, where something did happen: compassion and understanding. And I have to say that something similar happened that week, which probably was 6 or 8 years later, at Gethsemane, that monastery in Kentucky. I arrived for the retreat during a pretty stressful time in my life, and I was hoping the retreat would bring me some kind of calm and comfort. I wish I could tell you that, unlike my previous experience with silence, something clicked and I immediately went to that place of love and compassion, peace and feeling centered. But the more I wrote in my journal about my need to move beyond fear and anxiety, the stronger and more painful it got. I kept waiting for that voice of love and compassion to leap from my pen to the pages or to magically appear in my thoughts. But the voice remained silent and the anxiety continued. At my lowest point that week, I began to wonder if I was destined to live the rest of my life feeling just stressed out. But then, just as the fear was about to feel like I was going to give up with it, something unexpected helped me find my way to hope and called me back to the ultimate goodness and blessings of my life. And that something was once again waiting, but this time it was waiting in darkness. And I'm not talking about emotional darkness or the dark night of the soul, although I think I was experiencing both at the time. Rather, what helped me find that place of healing and hope was actual physical darkness that I experienced at the monastery. I mentioned earlier that the monks engage in a regimen of regular prayer services that take place both during the day and at night. And there is one service that's held right before the monks turn in for the night called Compline. And at the end, it's held usually around 8:30, 9 o'clock, so it's dark outside, the surroundings are dark. And near the end of that service, all the lights in the abbey are turned out. And the only light one can see are 2 candles at the far end of the sanctuary that are gently flickering. After about a minute in darkness and silence, the abbey bells chime several times. Then the monks very beautifully resume their chanting. And after they complete that chant, the lights come back on and the service continues. Although I can't fully explain it, that minute of waiting in darkness and anticipating the coming of light, somehow it just brought me hope. Every night at that service, I found myself waiting for the darkness and waiting in the darkness. And what I experienced was not the kind of darkness that leaves us feeling afraid or lost, but rather darkness that felt like a warm, comforting blanket that made me feel safe and at home. And what I also found as I waited in the darkness was light. Light that was faint and distant, but oh so beautiful. Light that helped me remember that there is hope, there is peace, and that there is love to be found in the darkness and even in the dark, scary places of life. By the time the retreat was over, I had a new perspective, a new relationship with stress, with the stress and anxiety I had been feeling. They were still with me because stress and anxiety, they're part of life. But since my experience waiting and listening in the darkness, I think I'm more at peace with those stressful times, better able to talk about them and confront them, and capable of reminding myself that in spite of the uncertainties of life, I am blessed with great love and great joy. Waiting in the darkness made me aware of just how blessed my life is, and it gave me the peace of mind I needed to move on from fear and anxiety so that I could live from a place of deep, deep gratitude. And my experience with waiting and listening in the darkness leads me back to the waiting that is at the heart of Advent. You see, while we often characterize that waiting as anticipation for the return of Jesus at the end of time, I can't help but feel that what the season is also calling for is a deep spiritual connection to what Jesus of Nazareth shared with the world and with all of us. Unconditional love, compassion, gentleness, peace, and kindness. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the time Christians are invited to do this deep spiritual work happens to be the darkest time of the year. And there's one more thing I'd like to say about the power of waiting. The healing I experienced waiting in the darkness at the Abbey, it didn't just help me live from a place of more gratitude and peace. It also re-energized me to work for justice and fairness in a world that needs and is waiting for us. Waiting for us to embody the kind of unconditional love and courage that Jesus of Nazareth used to challenge a broken and unjust status quo of his day. This experience, I'll say, of darkness and waiting was so powerful and compelling that I actually did that experience. I'm saying a little prayer, hoping they're okay. But that experience was so powerful and compelling that when I returned to the congregation I was serving at the time, we actually created our own UU version of that service. And it was extremely peaceful and comforting, and it was something that continued to deepen my practice and enrich my heart. So it was just really something. If any of you are interested in hearing more about it or talking with me about it, as you can already hear, I go on and on and on about it. So let me just close with these words from our reading from Leslie Takahashi. We are waiting. We are waiting for a world which can know justice. We are waiting for a lasting peace. We are waiting for the bridge to span the divides which separate us. And we are most assuredly waiting for a promise and a hope. For all of this, we are waiting. Amen. Thank you so much for listening, and blessed be.